The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October 1961. Dean Martin was sound asleep in his Beverly Hills mansion when the shrill ring cut through the darkness like a knife. He'd been dreaming about his childhood in Steubenville, about his father's barber shop, about simpler times when a nickel could buy you a Coca-Cola, and the biggest worry in the world was whether the Cleveland Indians would make it to the World Series. But this wasn't Steubenville. This was Hollywood. And in Hollywood, 3 a.m. phone calls meant one of two things. Someone was dead, or someone was about to be. Dean reached for the receiver with a steady hand, though his heart was already racing. Years of living on the edge had taught him to expect the worst and hope for something slightly better. Yeah? His voice was gravelly with sleep and cigarettes. Mr. Martin? The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and absolutely terrifying. This is Vincent Torrino. I think we need to have a conversation. Dean sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. Vincent Torrino wasn't just any voice in the night. He was the man who collected debts for the Chicago outfit. He was the man they sent when polite reminders had failed. He was the man who turned kneecaps into powder and dreams into nightmares. Vincent, Dean said, trying to keep his voice casual. Kind of late for a social call, don't you think? This isn't social, Mr. Martin. This is business. Your business, specifically. The business you've been avoiding for 3 months. Dean's stomach dropped. He knew exactly what business Vincent was talking about. The poker game at Mickey Cohen's place back in July. The game that was supposed to be friendly. The game where Dean had lost $340,000 in a single night. $340,000. More money than most people would see in a lifetime. Money Dean didn't have. Money he'd borrowed against future earnings, against promises, against the assumption that Dean Martin's luck would always hold. But luck, as Dean was learning, had a way of running out when you needed it most. Look, Vincent, Dean said, swinging his legs out of bed and reaching for his cigarettes. I know I'm behind on the payments, but you guys know I'm good for it. I've got shows booked solid through next year. The money's coming. Vincent's laugh was like ice cracking. Mr. Martin, with all due respect, we're not a bank. We don't offer payment plans, and we certainly don't extend credit to entertainers who think their autographs are legal tender. Dean lit his cigarette with shaking hands. What are you saying? I'm saying you have 48 hours to come up with $340,000 plus the $85,000 in interest that's been accumulating since July. Total amount due, $425,000, cash. The number hit Dean like a physical blow. $425,000. He made good money, great money even, but not that kind of money. Not all at once. Not in 48 hours. And if I can't? Dean asked, though he already knew the answer. Mr. Martin, you're a smart man. You grew up in Steubenville. You know how these things work. We don't like to hurt celebrities. It's bad for business. But we like being stiffed even less. The line went dead. Dean sat in the darkness of his bedroom, smoking and thinking. Outside, the sprinklers were watering his perfectly manicured lawn. Inside, his perfect life was falling apart. He'd been gambling since he was 15 years old. Started with nickel poker games in the back of his father's barber shop, moved up to bigger games in Cleveland, then Chicago, then Vegas. Gambling was in his blood like music and cigarettes and the need to perform. But this was different. This wasn't a bad night at the craps table or losing big at blackjack. This was mob money. This was money that came with consequences that made bankruptcy look like a vacation. Dean got dressed and drove through the empty streets of Los Angeles thinking. He could call Frank. Frank had connections. Frank had money. Frank might be able to help. But Frank also had a big mouth and bigger problems of his own. Getting Frank involved would mean getting the entire Rat Pack involved, and Dean wasn't ready for that conversation. He could sell the house, but even if he could find a buyer willing to pay full price immediately, it wouldn't be enough. His cars, his jewelry, his investments, liquidating everything might get him halfway there, but halfway wasn't going to keep his kneecaps intact. As the sun began to rise over the Hollywood Hills, Dean found himself parked outside the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. He'd driven 4 hours without really thinking about where he was going. But now he knew. If he was going to solve this problem, it had to be here. In the place where he'd created the problem. The casino was just waking up. Early morning gamblers nursing hangovers and regrets sat at slot machines, feeding quarters into mechanical dreams. Dean walked through the main floor, past the tables where he'd won and lost millions over the years, and headed straight for the elevator. Jack Entratter's office was on the top floor. Jack was the Sands entertainment director, the man who booked the Rat Pack, the man who'd helped make Dean Martin a Vegas legend. If anyone could help Dean figure a way out of this mess, it was Jack. But when Dean knocked on Jack's door at 7 a.m., he found more than just Jack waiting for him. Sitting across from Jack's desk, wearing an expensive suit and an expression that could freeze hell, was Mickey Cohen himself. The man who'd hosted the poker game where Dean had lost his shirt and everything else. "Dino," Mickey said without getting up. "Heard you might be stopping by." Dean's hand instinctively moved toward the door handle, but Jack gestured for him to sit down. "Close the door, Dean," Jack said quietly. "We need to talk." Dean closed the door and sat down, feeling like a man walking into his own execution. Mickey Cohen was a legend in his own right, though not the kind of legend Dean aspired to be. He was the West Coast representative of the Chicago outfit, a man who'd built an empire on other people's weaknesses and bad decisions. He was also, Dean realized with growing horror, probably the man Vincent Torrino reported to. "Relax, Dino," Mickey said, lighting a cigar. "Nobody's here to break your fingers. Not yet, anyway." Jack leaned forward. "Dean, Mickey came to me because he's got a proposition, something that might solve your problem." "I'm listening," Dean said, though every instinct told him to run. Mickey smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "You owe me $425,000, money I don't think you have." "That's right. But you've got something else, something potentially more valuable than money." Dean waited. "You've got access," Mickey continued. "You perform for heads of state, for politicians, for the kind of people who make decisions that affect millions of dollars in business interests." Dean's blood ran cold. "You want me to spy on people." "I want you to listen," Mickey corrected. "I want you to remember conversations. I want you to occasionally mention opportunities that might interest certain parties. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would compromise your reputation or your safety." "You want me to be an informant?" Mickey shrugged. "I want you to be smart. You do a little light intelligence gathering for us. Nothing illegal, nothing that would hurt anyone. And your debt disappears. Plus, you get a regular monthly payment for your services. Think of it as a consulting fee." Dean looked at Jack, hoping for some sign that this was a joke, a misunderstanding, anything other than what it appeared to be. But Jack's expression was deadly serious. "What kind of information?" Dean asked. "Political stuff, mostly," Mickey said. "Who's supporting what bills? Which senators are vulnerable to pressure? Which judges might be sympathetic to certain arguments? The kind of information that helps us make better business decisions." "And if I say no?" Mickey's smile disappeared. "Then Vincent Torrino pays you another visit. And this time, it won't be a phone call." Dean sat in silence for a long moment. Outside Jack's window, he could see the Vegas Strip stretching into the desert, the city that had made him rich and famous and apparently completely trapped. "I need time to think," Dean said. "You've got until tonight," Mickey said, standing up. "I'll be in the Copa room for your show. Give me your answer then." After Mickey left, Dean and Jack sat in uncomfortable silence. "Jesus, Jack," Dean finally said. "How did it get this bad?" Jack poured 2 glasses of whiskey, even though it wasn't even 8 a.m. "You got careless, Dean. You got too comfortable. Started betting like the house money was your own money." "I can't do what he's asking. I can't spy on people who trust me." Jack nodded. "I know. That's why we're going to figure out another way." "We?" "Dean, you've made the Sands more money than any performer in the history of this place. You think I'm going to let Mickey Cohen turn you into his personal snitch? Not a chance." For the next 12 hours, Jack Entratter worked the phones like a man possessed. He called in favors from casino owners, entertainment executives, and wealthy businessmen who owed their social status to the performances Dean had given at their private parties. Meanwhile, Dean paced his hotel suite, chain-smoking and trying to figure out how his life had become a noir movie. The solution, when it came, was both simple and complicated. Jack had convinced 5 different casino owners to loan Dean money against future performances. Not just any performances, exclusive, high-paying private shows for their wealthiest clients. Shows that would pay double Dean's normal rate, but would require him to perform at private parties, corporate events, and exclusive gatherings for the next 2 years. It meant giving up his freedom to choose his own bookings. It meant working twice as hard for the same money he used to make. It meant performing for oil executives in Dallas instead of fans in Vegas, for politicians in Washington instead of friends in Hollywood. But it also meant keeping his integrity intact. At 9 p.m. that night, Dean walked onto the stage of the Copa Room, knowing that Mickey Cohen was watching from table 7. He performed his usual set, smooth, effortless, charming. But when he finished his last song, instead of his usual quick exit, he walked down into the audience. He walked directly to Mickey Cohen's table and sat down. "So," Mickey said quietly, "what's it going to be?" Dean placed an envelope on the table. Inside was a cashier's check for $425,000. "It's going to be goodbye, Mickey," Dean said. "Nice doing business with you." Mickey opened the envelope, looked at the check, and laughed. "Where'd you get this kind of money, Dino?" "I borrowed it." "From who?" Dean smiled that famous smile. "From people who believe in me more than they fear you?" Mickey's expression hardened. "You think this is over?" "I think this is exactly over," Dean said, standing up. "Unless you want to explain to your bosses in Chicago why you're hassling Frank Sinatra's best friend after he's paid his debts in full." It was a bluff, but it was the right bluff. Mickey Cohen might have been dangerous, but he wasn't stupid. Causing problems for Dean Martin meant causing problems for Frank Sinatra, and causing problems for Frank meant dealing with people even Mickey didn't want to cross. Mickey pocketed the check. "Stay out of my poker games, Dino." "Wasn't planning on it," Dean said. But the real cost of Dean's gambling debt wasn't the money. It was what came after. For the next 2 years, Dean worked harder than he'd ever worked in his life. He performed at oil company parties in Texas, pharmaceutical conventions in Chicago, and political fundraisers in Washington. He sang for millionaires who didn't know good music from elevator music. He told jokes to audiences who laughed because they were supposed to, not because they thought he was funny. He performed his heart out for people who saw him as a commodity, not an artist. And slowly, something inside Dean Martin began to change. The easy charm that had always come naturally started to feel forced. The casual coolness that had defined his persona began to feel like a straitjacket. He was still Dean Martin, but he wasn't the Dean Martin he'd been before. His drinking, which had always been mostly performance, became real. His isolation, which had always been a choice, became a necessity. He started declining social invitations, avoiding industry parties, spending more and more time alone. Frank noticed first. "What's eating you, Dino?" he asked during a break in filming Ocean's 11. "You've been acting like someone shot your dog." Dean couldn't tell him the truth. Couldn't admit that he'd almost compromised everything they'd built together because he couldn't walk away from a poker table. "Just tired, Pally," Dean said. "Getting old." But Sammy Davis Jr. knew better. During a late-night conversation in Dean's dressing room, Sammy pressed the issue. "Dean, whatever's bothering you, whatever's eating at you, keeping it inside ain't helping anybody." Dean looked at his friend, this man who'd faced more adversity than any person should have to face, and almost broke down. "Sammy," Dean said quietly, "what would you do if you'd done something that could have destroyed everything? Not just for you, but for everyone around you?" Sammy was quiet for a long moment. "I'd make sure it never happened again," he said finally, "and I'd find a way to turn it into something good." That conversation changed everything for Dean. He realized that his gambling addiction wasn't just about the thrill of winning or the fear of losing. It was about the need to feel something real in a world that often felt artificial. So, Dean made a decision. He started using his mandated private performances, the ones he was doing to pay off his debt, to actually connect with people. Instead of going through the motions, he began really looking at his audiences. He started seeing the lonely oil executive whose wife had left him, the pharmaceutical CEO who was struggling with his own addiction, the politician who was carrying secrets that were eating him alive. And he began to realize that everyone, no matter how rich or powerful, was dealing with something. Everyone was carrying pain, or fear, or regret. Dean started tailoring his performances to these smaller, more intimate audiences. He began telling stories instead of just singing songs. He started having real conversations with people instead of just delivering punchlines. And something remarkable happened. These supposedly soulless corporate events became some of the most meaningful performances of Dean's career. Not because the venues were special, but because Dean had learned to see the humanity in his audience. A pharmaceutical executive in Chicago broke down crying during Dean's performance of Everybody Loves Somebody because it reminded him of his late father. A oil company vice president in Dallas asked Dean to sing That's Amore because it was the song he'd danced to at his wedding 50 years earlier. These moments weren't captured by cameras or reviewed in newspapers, but they were real in a way that Dean's public performances sometimes weren't. By the time Dean had worked off his debt, he'd learned something valuable. The worst mistake of his life had taught him how to be a better performer and a better person. He never gambled seriously again. Not because he couldn't, but because he no longer needed to. The artificial thrill of risking everything at a poker table couldn't compete with the real satisfaction of connecting with another human being through music. Years later, when people asked Dean Martin about his most memorable performances, he never mentioned the Sands or the Copa Room or any of the famous venues where he'd made his reputation. He talked about singing "Memories Are Made of This" for a grieving widower in a Dallas hotel ballroom. He talked about performing Ain't That a Kick in the Head for a group of World War II veterans at a pharmaceutical company retreat in Chicago. These weren't the performances that made headlines, but they were the performances that mattered. The gambling debt that almost destroyed Dean Martin's life became the thing that saved it, not financially. He would have found a way to pay the money back eventually, but emotionally, spiritually, artistically, it taught him that real coolness isn't about never caring. It's about caring so much that you're willing to risk looking uncool. It taught him that real success isn't about how much money you can win. It's about how many lives you can touch. And it taught him that sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most important discoveries. Dean Martin never told this story publicly. It wasn't the kind of story that enhanced a legend or sold records. But for those who knew him well, it explained everything about the man he became in his later years. The man who was more interested in genuine moments than grand gestures. The man who preferred small audiences to large crowds. The man who understood that sometimes the most meaningful performances happen when nobody famous is watching. Mickey Cohen never bothered Dean again. Vincent Torrino moved on to other debtors, other threats, other late-night phone calls. But Dean Martin carried the lessons of that terrible October night for the rest of his life, not as a burden, but as a gift. Because sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you turns out to be exactly what you needed all along.